Hello, good day. This video introduces the general principles of futures and forward contracts. At the end of this learning session, it is hoped that you can describe the basic characteristic of futures and forward contracts, as well as explain how they can be used to manage risk. Stay tuned and let's learn together. What is a derivative? A derivative is a financial instrument with a value that is reliant upon or derived from an underlying asset or group of assets. The payoff of derivative depends on the value of the underlying asset. A derivative is a contract between two parties. As a form of legal contract, derivatives have a definite lifespan and expire on a specified date. The two parties involved are the buyer and the seller. The buyer, who purchases the derivative, holds a long position. On the other hand, the seller, who sells the derivative, holds a short position. A derivative contract always defines the rights and obligations of each party. The common types of derivative include forwards, futures, options, and swaps. Derivatives may also include sophisticated instruments such as credit derivatives, weather derivatives. We are going to learn more in the next few videos. Stay tuned! As we have just learned, a derivative is a contract whose value is derived from that of some other asset, known as underlying. The common derivatives underlyings are equities, treasury bills, bonds, currencies, and commodities. The derivative underlyings also include interest rates, credit, energy, weather, and even other derivatives, all of which are not generally thought of as assets. First, let's start with learning about futures contract. What is a futures contract? How many parties are involved in a futures contract? Who are the parties? What is the contract about? When will the transaction take place? I'm sure you can get the answer from this slide. A futures contract can be defined as an agreement between two parties, whereby the buyer takes delivery and the seller makes delivery of a particular good or asset at a particular date in the future and at an agreed price. What are the key differences between cash market and futures market? Cash market is a market where a product or commodity changes hands in exchange for a cash price paid when the transaction is completed. Assets are bought or sold for immediate settlement or delivery at spot price. Futures market is a market where participants buy and sell contracts for delivery on a specified date in the future. The futures price, delivery date, and quantity are all set when the futures contract is created. Delivery and payment occurs at some agreed upon date in the future. Futures contracts are standardized agreements. Futures contracts have specific underlying assets, quantities, times to expiration, delivery, and settlement conditions. Clearinghouse designs and underwrites all contracts. Futures contracts are traded on a futures exchange. The exchange offers facilities in the form of physical location, electronic system, as well as liquidity provided by authorized market makers. The seller of futures contracts has a legally binding obligation to make delivery of the stated quantity on specified dates in the future. On the other hand, the buyer or holder of futures contracts has a similar obligation to take delivery of the underlying assets. Futures contract has no limit on exposure to loss. By standardizing these contracts and creating an organized market with rules, regulations, and a central clearing facility, the futures markets offer an element of liquidity and protection against loss by default. Futures are used for both speculation and hedging. Speculators are investors who trade futures contracts simply to earn a profit on expected swings in the price of a futures contract. Speculation involves betting on future price movements. They have no inherent interest in the commodity or financial futures. Speculators are prepared to accept risks that hedgers do not wish to assume, and they provide liquidity to the market. The assistance of speculators helps to ensure that there is an active market and that at any given time, buyers and sellers are both in operation. Hedgers are commodity producers and processors who use futures contracts to protect their interests in an underlying commodity or financial instrument. Hedging is done to protect against a price change that would otherwise negatively affect profits. Hedgers uses a futures contract to protect against adverse price movement and to lower risks. Let's learn some basic futures trading mechanics. If investors believe that prices will increase, they will take a long position, that is, buy a future contract. Conversely, investors who expect a price decline will take a short position by selling a futures contract. Take note that investors need not take delivery of the underlying asset. Investors can liquidate both long and short positions simply by executing an offsetting transaction. Offsetting transaction means investors with long position can sell and those with short position can buy to offset the transaction. In general, only about 1% of all futures contracts are settled by delivery. The rest are offset prior to the delivery month. All futures contracts are traded on a margin basis. To buy or sell futures contract, a trader must have a margin account with a broker and must deposit initial margin into the account. Buying on margin means putting up only a fraction of the total price in cash. Margin is the amount of equity that goes into the deal. The margin is a collateral held against the possibility that the trader may not be able to meet the contractual obligations. The margin required usually ranges from about 2% to 10% of the contract value. The clearinghouse stipulates the minimum initial margin that must be deposited. The amount varies according to the type of contract and is based on the maximum likely movement in the value of the futures contract. The futures margin is very low compared to the margin required for stocks and most other securities. There is no borrowing required on the part of the investor to finance the balance of the contracts. There are different levels of margins. Let's learn more about them. In general, margin deposit refers to the amount deposited with a broker to cover any loss in the market value of a futures contract that may result from adverse price movements. Initial margin is the amount of investor capital that must be deposited with a broker at the beginning of the transaction. Maintenance margin is the minimum amount of margin that must be kept in the margin account at all times after the trade is initiated. Maintenance margin is always significantly lower than the initial margin. If the value of the account falls below this value, the trader receives a margin call. What is a margin call? A margin call is a request to deposit additional funds. Margins and margin calls safeguard the position of the clearinghouse. If the trader fails to deposit additional funds to bring up his balance above the maintenance margin, positions are closed out before the margin account is exhausted. The trader's losses are recovered and the clearinghouse is not put at risk. Let's look into an example on marking to market. At the time when the futures contract is entered, the futures price is £1,000. The initial margin requirement is £200 and the maintenance margin level is £150. Both buyers and sellers deposit initial margin of 200. On day 1, the futures price increases to £1,100. This results in a gain of £100 to the buyer and a loss of 100 to the seller. The balance in the margin account of the buyer increases to £300, while the balance in the margin account of the seller reduces to £100. As the maintenance margin is £150, the seller has to deposit £50 into his account, bringing the balance to £150. On day 2, the futures price dropped to £1,050. This results in a gain of £50 to the seller and a loss of £50 to the buyer. The balance in their accounts are adjusted accordingly. On day 3, the futures price drops further to £950. The gain to the seller is £100 and the balance in his account increases from £200 to £300. The seller's accumulated net gain is £50, which is the balance of £300 minus his total deposits of £250. The accumulated net loss of the buyer is the opposite of the seller. Futures contract is a zero-sum game. The return on invested capital of futures contract can be calculated with the formula listed in this slide. Basically, the change in price is compared to the amount of margin deposit to obtain the return. Let's try and calculate the profit and return on invested capital in this example. Assume you buy a March silver contract at 1065 or $10.65 an ounce. The required initial margin is $6,075. One silver contract involves 5,000 troy ounces. How to calculate the answers for the questions? Well, take note of the change in futures price. A buyer will make a profit when the futures price increases, and he will make a loss when the futures price decreases. Take note of the unit price of the silver contract and the contract size of 5,000 troy ounces. I have listed the final answer at the end of this slide to guide you. I hope you will get the answer correct. Happy trying! Second, we are going to learn about forward contract. A forward contract is an agreement between two parties to buy or sell an asset at a given date in the future at a specified price. The given price is known as delivery price. Forward contracts are traded over the counter, OTC. OTC trading takes place through networks of dealers that are employed by financial institutions. OTC trading does not take place on an exchange. One party to the forward contract assumes a long position and contracts to purchase the underlying asset at a specified date at a given price. The other party assumes a short position and agrees to sell the asset on the same date at the same price. A typical participant in a forward contract is a commercial or investment bank that, serving the role of the market maker, is contacted directly by the customer. Forward contracts are not standardized and are not transferable. Forward contracts are individually designed agreements and can be tailored to the specific needs of the ultimate end user. What are the key contents in a forward contract? A forward contract must specify the price, a description of the item concerned or underlying assets, the delivery dates and conditions. Examples of forward contracts include order a motor car, arrange a mortgage, or order foreign currencies. Let's look into more examples on how forward contract can be used for hedging purpose. A farmer who needs to sell his wheat crops at some date in the future can protect himself from a price fall by selling a forward contract. A manufacturer who needs to buy flour at some date in the future can protect himself from a price increase by buying a forward contract. They can use a forward contract to lock in the price and create certainty about the price. However, take note that they can still effectively be worse off than if they had not hedged. So far, we have learned about the basic characteristics of futures and forward contracts. Next, we are going to compare the differences between the two. Forward and futures contracts are different in a number of ways. Here are some of the key perspectives. I hope you can explore further based on the keywords. In this table, I have summarized some of the key differences between forward and futures contract. The most important point is forward contract is highly customized for specific investment banks clients, while futures contracts are standardized and traded in an exchange. Finally, we have come to the end of this video. I hope you have learned some knowledge from this video. If you like this video, please click like, share or subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you. See you and goodbye.